you very much for a very challenging lecture, raising a huge number of questions and important issues. I hope now we can have an engaged kind of conversation and discussion. You reminded us early on of a guiding principles of journalism about speaking truth, about acting independently, minimizing harm, that there was success in addressing the sectarian divide, but other divides you said had opened up. I was wondering what some of those maybe were, and you might care to address that at some point. With no opposition at Stormont, there is a system open to corruption, and so scepticism is important to our politics in Northern Ireland, but that's not the same as cynicism. An intriguing suggestion that schools should teach media literacy, that journalism matters to democracy. Journalism is about holding power to account, asking the awkward questions, that the anger of voters was important in a story that you covered extensively. The public have an important role. And again, a last affirmation I think you made, that truth is central to democracy. Thank you for that. That should open up, I think, a lot of questions and comment. And it's over to the participants. I did see something go through from Kit about, I think maybe Kit, if you were prepared, Kit, to come live with that question. It disappeared off my chat box, but if you were to put that question to Sam, now that might be helpful.
The question is, do you think freedom of information has been counterproductive by making government more secretive?
Excellent question. I think it has been counterproductive in terms of how government has responded to it. I don't think that equates to saying that it is a bad idea. If you bring in a law which is fundamentally good, and if we set aside for now whether it was a good law or not, it's not a judgment on the efficacy of that law if somebody works to evade that law. And so therefore what we have seen, I think, is a civil service and a political class, not just in Northern Ireland. This is something which goes across much of the parts of the world that have FOI laws, but which really work to try to get around them. That, of course, was one of the arguments against bringing that law in. It was saying, look, this is human nature. People are going to try to evade it. But I think that having a means of the public being able to access information with all sorts of safeguards, and really, I mean, I make quite a lot of FOI requests, and I can tell you that it's very hard to get information, even where it is recorded. There are all sorts of exemptions for commercially sensitive information, for obviously things like national security, for personal data, etc., etc. And so therefore, it's not something where the government is opening up its vaults and pouring out all sorts of important facts that might be not in the public interest. But I think that not having that mechanism to get to information, which is ultimately created using our money as taxpayers by our servants, public servants, where it impacts on our lives, let's say perhaps in a very local situation, maybe where a road is built, maybe where somebody wants to build a high-rise block of flats behind your house, whatever it might be. I think it's important to have a principle that we as the public, and there are no special rights for journalists under that legislation, it's just that we happen to use it a bit more and we're a bit more informed about it, I suppose. But the principle of it, I think, is very important, that getting to see government secrets after 20 years, as it now is, under the 20-year rule, under the declassification of government files, is good and it's healthy, but it's far too late. By that stage, everybody who can be held to account has gone. And so having something there which gives us a window into government, I think, is important. But yes, as you say, I think the RHI story in particular made clear that there are all sorts of enterprising people in government who will use WhatsApp, text messages, private email addresses, phone calls, whatever it might be, to get around this. But ultimately, I think that is not in their interest, because RHI, I think, is really supreme example of how that runs out of road. If you don't, in a bureaucracy, record decisions, you can't operate a coherent bureaucracy. You need to record who took a decision. If you're a civil servant and through a sense of protecting your minister from embarrassment or whatever it might be, you don't record who took a decision. As we saw in the Cash for Ash situation, there were civil servants who went to the public inquiry and said, I told Arlene Foster X. And Arlene Foster went to the public inquiry and said, you did not tell me X. And Sir Patrick Coughlin said, where is the record of this meeting? And the civil servant said, well, we didn't take a record of this meeting, even though it involved a decision about hundreds of millions of pounds of public expenditure. And I think you can understand the incredulity of Sir Patrick as he listened to that evidence and was expected to believe that that he should believe anybody as to what went on in that. He was really reduced to having to look at those two people's evidence, how they came across in person, other facts, and trying to make an educated guess as to what had actually gone on there. And one of the really striking things, just finally, that was said at the inquiry was by, I think it was by the former director of finance for Arlene Foster's Stormont department at the time, which set up the RHI scheme. And he said, my biggest regret was that we didn't write down an awful lot more, because he was looking back and he just couldn't defend himself as a civil servant. And so therefore, one of the healthy things that I hear from within the civil service system is that there is more being written down now, that people have looked at that, they've seen that they've got hung out to dry in some cases. And so therefore, I think maybe that will be something that helps to redress that balance of people thinking that they can get away from the FOI obligations by simply not recording certain things.
Thank you, Sam. Ian, I think there was a question.
Sorry, you're frozen, Johnston. There's a question from Grace here I can read out. Do you think the reason so many people feel disenfranchised, especially the working class in Northern Ireland or in Labour heartlands in England, is a class issue rather than due to political journalism?
Well, that is an excellent question, and I think I'm just wondering exactly which of two potential questions it is, because I think there is the potential. I mean, class is an issue in newsrooms, as I alluded to. And so that unquestionably, I think, is an issue. If journalists come from the same class or overwhelmingly come from the same class, that is a problem. And that impacts on how we report politics and how we report everything else. There's also then, of course, the wider issue of, is it about those people being detached in a wider sense, aside from anything to do with journalism, because of their class, that they've got left behind. But I think that insofar as it relates to journalism, I do think that there is a massive problem. I think that Brexit is one of the things that exemplifies this, where overwhelmingly in London and in Belfast and in many of the capital cities, there was a sense in the media class that this was not going to happen, that people weren't going to vote for this. And I think, to be fair, that was also true among many people who supported Brexit. It was not, Nigel Farage was somebody who on the night started off conceding, saying that they had lost. So it was not as straightforward as just the media, but I think there is a problem. And going back to something that Johnston asked about, some of the other divides here, which touches on this, I think that there is a geographical divide within journalism, where whether it is the London-centric media, with Channel 4 News, with the BBC, with ITN, etc., or the big Fleet Street newspapers, or whether it is Belfast, where the media in Northern Ireland is overwhelmingly concentrated on Belfast. And even as a largely rural newspaper, the Newsletter, which I write for, I'm based in Belfast. My editor is based just outside of Belfast. The deputy editor is in Belfast. You know, there is a real concentration, I think, inevitably in a country, of many of the institutions in the capital city or in a major city in an urban area. And that is not reflective of either the interests or the views necessarily, or the politics, or the class, or whatever it might be, of people across wider society. And so that is a problem, I think. And it's a problem which potentially the whole change during the pandemic of people working from home can be addressed to a certain extent, because people are moving out of cities, people are less tied to being physically in the newsroom. For the last year, we have got out a newspaper without being in the newsroom once. I can, sit in my pajamas and change the front page headline on the newsletter. And so that is potentially going to do something which might help to address that. But I'm not sure. So sorry if I haven't answered the question that was intended there. Apologies, and come back to me.
Where's Johnson gone to? Does Kathy want to come back on that at all? No, sorry, not Kathy, Grace.
No, well, there's another question here from Kathy.
Yes.
Can journalists play more of a role in enabling reconciliation instead of falling into the trap of encouraging antagonism?
I think that's maybe the best question so far, and it's the most difficult to answer. I think that inherent to journalism and inherent to politics in the democratic world is about testing positions, about questioning things. Hello, can you still hear me? Everybody's frozen there, I think.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes,
hello?
we can.
You can. Sorry.
We can hear you, Sam.
You can hear me, or you can't?
We can, yes.
You can. Great. Sorry, y'all froze there for a moment. So I think that if you look at it in a political context, we of course have the sectarian overlay in Northern Ireland. But if we set that aside and we look at politics, let's say in London, where you don't have that divide, you've got other divides, left, right, socially liberal, socially conservative, whatever it might be, urban, rural, etc., etc. The nature of democratic politics is that you have people arrayed on either side of the chamber. They argue about what the best way is to solve a particular problem. Should we tax the rich more, or would it be better if we cut taxes on the rich and they would create more wealth, or whatever it might be. And so therefore, I think that is really at the core of how our society resolves these issues. In a Northern Ireland context, of course, we've got the sectarian issue on top of that, which complicates it, which gives an extra danger, I suppose, to how those issues are adduced in the public square. But I think that there is a fine line between journalists trying to be responsible and trying to question whether how they are reporting something is in the public interest, whether it is something that is that can be defended on all sorts of levels, and seeing themselves as some sort of political players, people who are not simply there to tell it as it is, and who are starting to think, what does this mean for the future of devolution? If I report this story, might we lose Stormont, etc., etc. I think once you get into that territory, it's very dangerous. And I don't think that's what the question suggests we should do. But there is this argument for peace journalism, which to my mind is very well intentioned, but is also quite unintentionally dangerous, because there was a sense among many of my colleagues, I was at school at the time, so I can't take any responsibility for this, either for good or ill, but among many of my colleagues around the time of the Good Friday Agreement, there was a sense that they were very supportive of that agreement, for good reason, I think, for the noblest of reasons. They had been at the sharp edge, in many cases, of the Troubles. They had been at some of the atrocities before the police had even arrived. They knew what was going on. They knew the bloody nature of what had happened to our society. And they saw in this hope, and they wanted to do something to try to help that process along. And some of them are quite explicit now in public and in private about saying that they covered up certain things. They didn't report certain things because they thought they would damage the agreement. They would undermine support for the peace process. It was a very fragile floor for a very long period. And while that was very well intentioned, I think that was fundamentally wrong. And it was wrong, I think, because it was expedient in the short term, but I think it was very damaging in the long term. It undermined support for the sense that journalists tell it as it is, that they're not hiding things to support one side or the other in a political debate. And now one of the problems I think that journalism has, particularly in certain communities, and I'm thinking in particular here of sort of loyalist communities, is a sense that the media are not there simply to report the truth as they see it, that they are coming in with their own agenda. And that's not my experience of how we do journalism, but I think that is an unintended problem from that.
Johnson, you need to unmute. Johnson. I think you need to unmute.
That would be helpful, Helen.
We've all been there.
I don't know who muted me, but there you go. There was a question came through from Malcolm on chat box. Either Helen or Ian got that one.
Yes. Which one? Malcolm has two questions.
I'll take the first one.
The first one
Hold
is,
the second one.
well, the first one is the Assembly won't vote to liberalise libel laws to make the laws the same as GB. Is this a problem?
Yes, unquestionably so, and I'm delighted that someone has raised this issue. Obviously, Malcolm is paying attention to very important matters. This is something which, you know, I think outside the journalistic and legal community is, to my mind, not very well appreciated, and so therefore I'm delighted that Malcolm is well aware of this. So in 2012, I think it was, I'm starting to wonder if I've got the year right, but I think it was 2012, there was a decision taken by the DUP at Stormont. It was taken in secret, and it was only revealed when Lord Rana asked a parliamentary question in the House of Lords, which somebody drew to my attention about a year later. The DUP secretly blocked an attempt by the government in Westminster to get Northern Ireland to agree to them legislating on our behalf, what's known as a legislative consent motion, to allow them to legislate on our behalf to reform our libel laws, to increase the protections for public interest journalism, journalism which involves honest opinion, journalism which involves academic or scientific research. So that may well be in a scientific journal such as Nature, rather than the sort of journalism that I'm involved in. And this was in response to a series of massive and high profile problems, particularly in Great Britain, but also in Northern Ireland. There had been doctors who had been sued and had their houses on the line because they had given their honest concerns. In one case, there was a very high profile person called Peter Wilmshurst, who really faced a very long and grueling and expensive legal battle with a company because he had expressed a concern that a certain heart product was dangerous. It turned out it was dangerous. People's lives were at stake, and the libel laws were used to suppress this information. I don't see that side of the libel laws, but I do see very powerful politicians and other people regularly sending us solicitors' letters, something which the public don't get to see because unfortunately we can't report on that very often. And so the sense certainly among some people involved in the libel reform campaign in Great Britain, one of them was Lord Leicester, the eminent lawyer who had represented the Irish News in a really infamous restaurant review case in Belfast, where they had initially lost a honest review of a restaurant, a scathing review of a restaurant in West Belfast, but a judgment which was really so perverse that it would have led to all restaurant reviews across the UK being stopped, because they would have been indefensible in law, to the extent that the Times sent over their restaurant critic, Giles Coran, to do a scathing review of the same restaurant, simply to make the point that this was something that they were going to stand up for. And if you're going to sue the Irish News, well, you're going to have to sue the Times as well. Ultimately, they won. But Lord Leicester said on reflection that when he looked at this, he could see no good reason that politicians in Northern Ireland would block this, particularly to do it in secret and not do it openly in the legislature, other than that they wanted to keep it easy for them to sue and therefore suppress awkward information about themselves. And so therefore that is a massive issue. Mike Nesbitt, the former Ulster Unionist leader, has tried to bring a private member's bill about this. There's no real prospect of this changing anytime soon, but it is a very important element of what goes on behind the scenes, which has implications for what we're able to report to you.
And a question from Colin.
Do you want the question read out, Johnson?
Yeah, please, yeah, because I'm not getting it.
Okay. How do you flush out politicians who have something the public should know, but hide behind a veil of secrecy? The two major parties have become expert at this.
Well, journalists just have to become expert at flushing it out, I suppose. That's our job, and I think there's always going to be a healthy tension in a democratic system between those who govern and those who scrutinize those who govern, and whether that be the courts, whether that be opposition politicians, whether that be the media, that is fundamentally a healthy tension to have. And if there's too much power on either side, I think that's unhealthy, and it would be equally unhealthy for the media to have too much power over those who are democratically elected. So I think that with time, we do become more skillful at this. We do manage to build up sources in those parties who are willing, for whatever reason, sometimes for high-minded reasons of the public interest, sometimes for pretty base reasons of personal advancement, are willing to spill the beans as to what's going on, and that is something which, you know, is really part of what it takes to be a journalist, I suppose. And it's imperfect. It's something which is not a science, but it's really, I suppose, at the core of what I do most days.
And Helen, there's a question from Norma Gallagher, and then I think Gordon Kennedy has been waiting maybe to come in live, but we know he's not.
Right. Okay. Well,
does David want to read out his question? David Gallagher wants.
I'll read out Norma's question if you want. It's to do with education. A comment about Sam's suggestion about media literacy, posted by a former politics teacher, however. Would Sam accept that in history, which is compulsory at Key Stage 3 and English up to Key Stage 4, that the skills of critical thinking, bias, and evidence versus opinion are covered? Is that sufficient? Did you get that okay, Sam?
Yes, I did. I did. Thank you, Norma. I mean, I suppose I'm basing this on my own personal experience, which is obviously highly anecdotal, and my observations about how people interact with the media, and particularly young people, rather than any great knowledge of the curriculum. So my apologies to teachers if I'm suggesting something that is already being done. But I think that as media changes, and as it changes really at an increasingly rapid rate, where we are seeing with social media, with new forms of social media that even I probably in some cases haven't even heard of, let alone know how they operate. There is a need, I think, for this to move beyond the theoretical and into how it's applied, how these things operate, how we should look out for bot accounts, for instance, on social media, people who are posting as a network of people who are hiding their real identities, trying to skew public opinion, are not real people, and how to consume traditional media and how to question that and how that's put together, etc., etc. So yes, those are the principles behind it, but I think that you know, it is so important to democracy, to how we live our lives, to much of the modern world and how we understand the modern world, that I think it is important for that to be applied very directly, and both in terms of what we would think of as the mainstream media, and what I'm employed to work in, but also for increasingly the social media outlets from which many people now get their news.
Helen, there was a question from Brian Wilson. If we could take that and then take Malcolm's second question.
Yeah, and then
Gordon Kennedy wanted a question, I think. If
you've anybody who wants to come in live as well, Johnson, after that, maybe you were saying Gordon maybe wanted to come in.
Gordon indicated that he wasn't. I misunderstood.
Right, okay. Brian's question is, how useful are lucid talk polls to journalists in Northern Ireland? Or as Jim Allister claims, do only political anoraks complete them?
Well, that's a very good question. It's obviously a very informed audience. They are useful. There is a real problem, I think, in Northern Ireland, that we have a paucity of regular and reliable polling in Dublin, in London, in Edinburgh. There are regular opinion polls, particularly Sunday newspapers. You will be able to track who's up, who's down, how the public are reacting to a scandal, what the impact on Boris Johnson is of whatever he announced last week, etc., etc. And we just don't have that in Northern Ireland. And for a long time, I've thought that gives really an unfair advantage to the incumbent parties, because in the absence of evidence that they have shed enormous support since the last election, we assume that, you know, the DUP and Sinn Féin are still overwhelmingly dominant, when actually the truth might be more complicated than that. And that then has a subtle impact on how we perceive them, on how voters perceive them, on how they vote in some cases, and whether they think they can afford to vote for another party, or whether they're going to split a vote that might be quite tight, all of those sorts of things. So by having polling from Lucid Talk, that is something which gives us some sense of what is going on. I do think, though, there is a problem in how those polls are done, and it is, as the questioner suggests, and as Jim Allister questions, that I think they tend towards the people who are much more politically engaged. They are the sort of thing that are circulated on social media. I've seen politicians circulating them, saying, you know, get in here, put your opinion in here, make sure our view is reflected. Now, the company will say, we're aware of this, we have got algorithms that try to stop people voting multiple times and all of this, and I'm sure that they do. But I think that there is an inherent problem in a polling sample which begins with a disproportionately engaged political audience. So those who are not following politics, who might not vote at all, when it comes to a question, for instance, like Irish unity, we would expect to see a really high turnout in a border poll, 80–90% perhaps. That therefore is only going to be reflected in the polling if we're pulling in people who don't vote right now. And too often, I think in Lucid Talk polls, those people aren't pulled in. And so therefore, we don't really know conclusively how those people would act.
Have you got Malcolm's second question there, Helen?
Yes. Can journalists, especially in short contracts, feel forced to write articles they feel are not really true?
I'm trying to think if I've ever been on a short contract. I've been, I suppose, on the shortest of short contracts, in that I've done daily shifts. So I suppose that's, you know, if you're not going to have any guarantee of being there the next day, that's pretty short. But yes, I think that is again something which inevitably, if somebody in any line of business is not guaranteed their job the next day or the next month or the next year, it is something which is going to be a pressure on them to keep their boss happy. And if their boss is asking for something that is unethical or improper in some way, that is going to be a pressure. I can't say that I've any great experience of that personally, however, and I think that a lot of the problems in journalism are more subtle than that. I suppose it's about people who maybe feel under pressure, particularly in the modern age now, to get a certain number of web hits, where people are being quantified in terms of how popular their stories are. And so it's things like that, sort of pushing people towards clickbait, sensationalism. It's not necessarily a boss, certainly in my experience, standing over you and saying, write this story, it's not true, or, you know, batting away your concerns that it might not be true. But I'm sure that does happen. And there is, I think, inevitably, where people have job insecurity, there is more of a problem there.
And David Campton, Helen, posted a question.
Yes, I think it's more a comment than a question, Johnson.
Okay.
I suspect, David says, I suspect that young people are more adept at this than many teachers and current mainstream journalists.
That may well be true.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions out there? Sam, could you say
Gordon has a question, Johnson.
Oh, Gordon got a question. Do you want to come live, Gordon, this time?
I'll have a go.
Go ahead. You're
yes,
on.
go on.
I'm reflecting back at an early stage in your talk, Sam. You did sort of talk about the issue of no time for detailed investigations. Surely that situation is really increasing, so that it's getting harder and harder to get enough time allocated to really get to the bottom of, well, obviously you don't know how major necessarily issues may be, but how do we manage to try and keep up that sense of oversight of really looking into issues?
Well, certainly it's true that there is decreasing time, and there are increasing demands on the time that one has, and so therefore that really does tend towards people not doing things that are in depth. And even in my experience, whereas when I started as a journalist, 15 odd years ago or whatever it was, it would have been really common, not just when I was at the Belfast Telegraph at that point, for there to have been an investigations correspondent who just did investigations and very in-depth stuff. It was David Gordon, who was a very fine journalist, but there was a regular sense that individual correspondents, the health correspondent, political correspondent, crime correspondent, would take a day, 2 days, 3 days off diary just to look into something in great depth. And that was part and parcel of the newsroom. But you can only do that when you've got enough colleagues there to pick up the slack on those days. And so that is certainly something that is much less common these days. However, I think that there is, I think, some hope in this, in that some of the old adages within journalism about what the public were interested in have been disproven by web analysis of what people actually read. And so therefore, when it comes to things like very long articles, in-depth articles, long reads, really getting into a topic, whether it's analysis or telling a story or whatever it might be, there was a sense, and I remember, several very experienced and very, very fine editors when I was a young journalist saying to me that, people won't read anything more than 1,000 words in a newspaper, and the Times would never run anything more than 1,000 words. And there were various things around this, that it was about breaking things up, having little sidebars and fact boxes, and keeping everything short. And actually, while there is, I think, an element of truth in that in print, online, the real growth area, and particularly in getting people to subscribe, because you can now actually not just link what people are reading, but link to what led them to subscribe, is increasingly those really in-depth, really long, maybe 3,000-4,000 word articles that really get stuck into something, that tell a story really expertly, and that takes time, it takes expertise. And so therefore, I suppose coming back to what I said about the democratization of this, I think there is hope in this for all of us, that what we take an interest in ultimately leads to at least some of that being supplied to us on the other side of the equation.
Thank you.
Sam, could you say a little bit about the journalistic ethical code?
I should look it up because I don't have it in front of me. I used to have it in my wallet here, but essentially, I mean, at its core, I think what pointers say is a very good distillation of what is involved. I mean, it's about being honest. It's about acting with integrity. It's about giving people a right to reply where we're making serious allegations about them. It's about explaining things to the best of our knowledge, not withholding information that we know is important, that is relevant, that would help to explain the other side of the story if there is one. It's about giving people enough time to respond when we approach them for comment, not going to them 10 minutes before the presses start to roll. It's about acting within the law. I mean, lots of it is fundamentally pretty basic. I mean, we regularly, I say regularly, probably every 2 or 3 years, we have got refresher courses on both the libel laws and on the journalistic code, the Society of Editors code that we're bound by. And it's part of my contract that if I break that, I can be sacked. So it's a pretty important thing to me. But I mean, it's not something that that really, I suppose, I regularly feel I have to go and consult, because a lot of it is just basic common sense as to how to be a good journalist. And so therefore, if something is ethically proper, and that I'm comfortable with that, and I think one of the sort of simple rules of thumb about this, which I suppose has got origins in some of Christ's teaching, since we're speaking in a church setting here about doing unto others as you would have them do to you, is about how would I feel about this if I was the subject of this story? Would I feel? I mean, I would obviously be very unhappy if the story is something that portrays me in a less than flattering light. But would I feel that I'd been treated fairly, that somebody had given me a chance to explain myself, that they hadn't distorted my quotes, that they hadn't left out key information? I mean, I think really at the core of journalism is simplification. And I suppose I see a lot in the world of bureaucracy in particular, when it comes to the civil service or big organizations like that. They're very good at having codes and having manuals and guidelines and committees and things of that nature. And ultimately, a lot of the time, that's not really much of a bulwark against bad behavior. We see in RHI how it wasn't a lack of codes or people being told that something was incorrect or unethical that stopped them doing it. It was much simpler things. It was about a culture of secrecy. It was a culture where nobody ever got held to account for bad behavior. It was about a culture where people didn't say to their colleagues, sorry, that's bad, that's wrong, you shouldn't be doing that. A culture where people didn't come forward as whistleblowers and say, actually, I see this going on in my organization. My loyalty is to the public, it's not to my organization. And so I'm blowing the whistle on this. And so I think that we can overcomplicate these things. It's important, I think, for journalists to have standards, to have codes, to have bodies that enforce those codes. Ultimately, the libel laws, as they are a very significant break on bad journalistic behavior, because there's a very significant financial sanction there if we get it wrong on that front. But ultimately, I think at its heart, this is about acting in a way that we know to be ethical and we know to be proper. We'll not always get that right, but where we know that we're getting it wrong, that's where we're in difficulty.
Great. I'm really impressed, Sam. You began with the Bible this evening.
Johnson, sorry, Johnson, we'll have another question.
Norma, I think, was posing a question, yeah?
Yeah. It's David Gallagher, actually.
Oh, David, okay, sorry.
And it's Sam, who is your journalistic role model? And what early lessons did you learn from the old hack? I was actually going to ask you too, did you always want to be a journalist? Because you're obviously very passionate about what you do.
Well, it's probably a fine example of how people drift into journalism from all sorts of varied backgrounds. You know, in my experience, I've worked with people who were lawyers, former policemen, people who really, you know, have worked in politics, have worked in government, and people have worked in all sorts of areas. And journalism at its heart is a pretty simple thing to do fundamentally. I mean, I think people sometimes complicate it. Of course, there's an element of experience giving you the means of doing it more quickly, doing it more expertly. But fundamentally, it's about speaking to people, interviewing them, asking them questions, finding out what happened, writing that down in pretty straightforward terms, and trying to communicate it simply to the public in a form that's digestible. I think most people could do that if they put their minds to it, frankly. And so I think that probably what one of my local journalistic heroes is David McKittrick, who for many years was the Ireland correspondent for the Independent newspaper, and who was also at The Economist as the Northern Ireland correspondent for many years. And so I think really what it was about his journalism was how it took his journalism beyond simply reporting what he saw happening, because that is at the core of journalism. It's absolutely foundational. Facts are sacred. They have to be. Otherwise, journalism is just my opinion, and you know that is frankly very boring and utterly pointless. It's not really moving anything on for somebody who wants to know what happened at that riot last night, what happened in Parliament yesterday, what happened in the High Court in Belfast yesterday. But it took it beyond simply reporting that, and it added to it context, analysis, explaining what went on, and it did it in a really fair-minded way. I think that everybody in Northern Ireland who is born into this society, whatever their personal views, however lightly they hold to their political views, they are viewed as from one side of the community or the other, inevitably. Their name, their school, the part of Northern Ireland they live in, whatever it might be. And I think what really was significant about David's journalism, and he was one of many people who did this, but he transcended his background. He managed in the middle of the Troubles, where people were being killed, where there was all sorts of pressure on journalists to explain this place to a national audience in a way that I think was able to convey the nuance of it, the intricacy of it, the fact that it wasn't a simple story, that it deserved careful study, but it was still a very interesting story to explain.
There was a comment, maybe it was more than a comment, a question, I think, Helen, from Kit again.
Yeah.
Yes, and this, I suppose this would be a good question to finish off with.
Okay.
Sam, would you like to take over from Stephen Nolan as official tribune of the people?
He'll be delighted that somebody has attributed that title to him, I'm sure. But no, certainly not. I love print journalism. And sorry, I'm just realizing that I forgot to actually answer the other part of the last question, which was that when I was a young person, when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a fighter pilot, which was truly absurd in retrospect, and I would have been very bad at it. But it shows, I suppose, how diverse we are in terms of where we come from, yeah, I think there is a real benefit, I think, as a print journalist, and print, I think, increasingly doesn't mean printed on a page. It means written in a permanent form, probably on a website. But there is a real value to being able to have a little bit more time, to being able to think about something, consider it just a little bit, even if it's only for half an hour, and think, actually, hang on a minute, what does that document really say? What is the top line in that story? What actually did that person say that was really significant? In broadcast journalism, you don't really have the luxury of that a lot of the time. You're thrust out there. You're immediately having to convey what has just broken. And you know, I've done some of that. It's quite enjoyable. It's very important to have that. But I do love the chance to be able to have more time to reflect, to be able to think a little bit more about what's actually happening, and hopefully to be able to make less mistakes, I suppose, as a result.
Sam, something you said a couple of minutes ago reminded me of something I came across recently, and I can't remember at the moment the source, but it was to the effect that comments are free, facts are sacred. You have engaged this evening with a lot of integrity and openness and honesty. And we're grateful to you for the way you've responded also to the many questions that have been put. So the more formal thanks, though, is to come from Alan Kerr, and I'm happy to hand over to him now. But thank you, Sam.